Hello everyone, today we talk about the causes of European communalism during the Middle Ages. So we have been talking, as you know, at least if you're a regular follower, a lot about European communes, chiefly about Italian communes for obvious reasons, but this is a European-wide phenomenon, and this is also important to recognize as communalism doesn't necessarily mean city-state or principates. It can also be really peasant communities, for example. And you can find them all around because really the community or the university, as it was called at the time, was really the basic form of association in the Middle Ages, right? So that was a common name. But, and definitely we will be talking a lot more in depth about the causes of the let's say the single causes of the rise of communes, and case by case we will do it in the future. Today I would like just to stress the I would say the methodological, historical, as well as historiographical difficulty to pinpoint I can say decisive, because in fact it wasn't even such a decisive element overall, but a series of determining factors that caused communalism, right? And here it's important to separate, in fact, as we were trying to do it just right now, between the development of cities and the development of communalism. These are two very different things, because there were cities that definitely had their own commune, and they all had, because the city in itself had fundamentally, it was a sum. Just imagine, it's like Baudin corporativist ideal, much later, but that really stemmed from this juridical background of the Middle Ages. It is to say that there are so many, there is a, well, in that case Baudin was stressing the importance of the body of the French monarchy, right? So, but this corporativist idea was based on the idea that the whole body, in that case of the monarchy, but of any other body, was political body, social body, was composed by other communities that were really all autonomous in some form, but they had to function all together, in that case for the sake of monarchy, etc. Naturally, just know that these are kind of monarchist perspectives that sometimes hide a little bit, and the French case is very peculiar in that sense, but they tendentially hide, even though we know it broadly through other sources, the lesser, the perspective of the lesser bodies, right? And it's obvious that it was a continuous struggle in the process of the formation of the modern state, fundamentally, between these lesser communities and the monarchies that were trying to advocate every chiefly juridical function for themselves, because at that point there were, as you know, several when we talk about rights associated to these pertinences, we're talking about money, so the right to cash certain things. And this was done sometimes, and actually all the time, with an exchange, until the rise of the nation state that allocates basically everything, for which the state becomes the only source of law. This is at least in the civil law, as it is still today, right? But in the Middle Ages it was very different, as you understand. And what is interesting in this perspective, that is often overlooked, in fact, in in the juridical studies as a whole, especially students that approach the history of European law, they rarely start, especially if they're going to prepare for they're going to become lawyers, or maybe they're even historians like contemporarists and modernists. I think it would be very, very beneficial for them to focus on what this thing had originated from in the Middle Ages, because otherwise you presume that this situation had immediately started from with the existence of some sort of central authority, of public authority, which is true, right? Because as you know, here monarchies ruled, and actually monarchies and empires came straight from the Romano-Germanic background, from a juridical point of view, that definitely stressed the need, albeit with different, juridical reasons, let's say, from the from a public authority, right? So the Middle Ages instead sees, especially after the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, and this proliferation of smaller communities that become sometimes even stronger than the public one. We have discussed this also many times. So the point I'm trying to make in here is that these communities were fundamentally developing autonomously, largely autonomous, almost, let's say, semi-independently, you can say. In many cases, naturally, there were situations in this sense in which, I don't know, usually, for example, I studied, just as an anecdote, when I studied history of law at university, that was basically from the Theodosian Codex to basically the Code Napoleon. So it's a lot of years of history, basically 13, 14 centuries. I studied only basically Western Europe. So, for example, I don't know how this, I have a rough idea of how this happened, for example, in Eastern Europe. But in that case, it's a bit different because, and that's a reason why I would like to dip in the thing, because in the West, more or less, there had always been an empire, right? Whether you're talking about the Roman Empire first, then this newborn empire, and here we're talking just from a jurisdictional point of view. This has nothing to do whether you consider the Holy Roman Empire as Roman or an empire, whatever. I personally do, especially in terms of the fact it was an empire, with all the limitations of the case, of course. Roman, so, but let's stick to the strictly jurisdictional perspective here. So there was always a public authority, right? Maybe this was not true, for example, in places like Ireland, for instance, and it would remain so for a very long time. But let's say that if you move in this Western, Southern Europe, you always find there is a strong public authority. In the East, it's different because there are popular laws. There are the laws of those particular peoples that evolve eventually, however, in relation with other authorities that are not pre-existing, like monarchies broadly meant as the one that will form, for example, in the Slavic, within the Slavs, Slavic populations in the East, but also there was not properly an empire. Like in there, also the relation with the Western Empire, much with the Byzantine one, were pretty, different, and they definitely varied from case to case, depending what you're talking about here. And this is important because it shows you that even the communal phenomenon is framed within a largely autonomous and tendentially autonomistic, like as a political direction context, and it's difficult to actually answer. The question, like, why did communes practically spread, right? It's obviously, as we were saying at the beginning, a sum of reasons, a sum of causes, but we can identify some, and it's particularly difficult to identify, let's say, one decisive one, because there is not a decisive one, quite likely, right? It's a sum of very changing situations, by the way, and that's the reason why European communes were so different within each other, depending on where you're talking about. So much of this, let's say, the historiographical debate that revolved around this topic was, first of all, it was very long, right? This is something that hasn't stopped even now, really. And it also was pretty controversial. Why? Exactly because, as you know, well, older historiographies had some kind of bias, towards communalism as well as towards history in general. So we live at a point in which objectivity has still not been usurped as a criterion of historical analysis, and we can say that up to this point we've come pretty damn far, and our historiographers are pretty accurate. Sometimes we lack a vision of ensemble, anyway, because especially for communalism, you understand that if you have a dramatically varied and heterogeneous and ever-changing situation, it's practically impossible to frame the development of European communes within a single study. Even it's really also a semantic problem. I mean, what is that we are really studying here? Like typologically speaking, how do we define communes? Which one we take into consideration? Which one we don't? So this is pretty complicated. I would say in popular culture, that is what obviously interests us in here. And that's why I mention it many times. It's because we're not in a university now, we are on YouTube. So we can talk only about certain things given the format that YouTube allows. And as you know, my video formats are pretty unusual already on this ground, because I speak for hours about topics that I don't even know how many people are really interested in. But the bet is really talking about this to spread some sort of awareness. As I told you, first of all, what are communes, right? If you Google communes, you will basically not really find anything related to medieval times, and you surprisingly find that this term is either not used, either it's treated under other definitions like city-states, but also in here we have seen how narrow, it's obvious that the city-state is, in medieval times, the most evident and most interesting form of commune, because it's the most developed one. It's also some of the best documented societies of the world medieval era. So that is evident, especially for certain contexts of Europe, the wealthiest ones, the most urbanized ones. Also in here, big cities with communal regimes existed all over Europe. Naturally, there was a concentration in certain geographical areas, but also in here, it's difficult to frame communes and communality in general, only talking about city-states. What about the rural communes? What about, other forms, and actually also other smaller communes that lived within the control of other communes? It did happen. It was dramatically frequent. What about the birth of regional states? Like, how sometimes a city-state would expand on others, right? And but still being based fundamentally on cities. So passing to a slightly deeper question, always in the realm of popular culture, how many people know effectively what communes are, and how many of them are willing to recognize their importance? Because if you go out there and you think the Middle Ages is just basically a stereotypical flatland of a completely rural environment with minimal progress and basically just knights and towers and that's it, basically. You can't even have an objective understanding of the Middle Ages. I mean, it's something that comes closer to it, at least as you know, there's nothing like a truly objective understanding, but let's say what approximates what we have achieved historiographically speaking. Secondly, how much importance do you credit, for example, even just to city-states? Because let's be honest about this, how many people really care compared to kingdoms or empires? What is the city-state? There is a dramatic low amount of awareness in popular culture in the West, and obviously much less outside of it, about what this stuff practically was, right? So it's dramatic in many ways, because how do you explain medieval civilization in the first place? And this is really the point. I mean, if you are recognizing that at a certain point Europe, or how you can frame in this sense at the time, started to expand, to grow, to think of itself, to produce knowledge, to apply technology, how can't you pass through communal civilization? It's impossible. Even if you want to explain eventually how from Middle Ages, let's say this stereotypical Middle Ages, you want to pass into humanism or the Renaissance, you have necessarily to pass through that. Well, I don't see this dialogue happening anywhere in popular culture at large, especially when compared with other topics, medieval history. Here, naturally, there are some countries that have dominated historiography, which is completely normal. This happens all the time. But that has sort of generated a view that, you know, the Middle Ages were only basically like those specific countries, and of certain specific centuries that in those countries were kind of better documented. So a general awareness about European let's say, I use the term diversity here with no, you know, in a much more different way than was is usually used today. You know, diversity in the sense of diversification, like of articulation, of development, and of differences, in spite of all the things that genuinely existed in common among Europeans, and not only, because obviously Europe was not a closed system, and it's pretty silly to interpret medieval European history if you don't consider Jewish culture, Muslim culture. It doesn't even, stop studying the Middle Ages if you're not willing to accept that, because it doesn't make sense. Take scholastics. How can you study scholastics if you don't know about that? So naturally, this would open to many other digressions relatively to what is the Middle Ages like. I mean, it seems by certain standards it's also been taken as a refuge by people who want to maybe exalt a certain past, who want to project their modern views on it, and use medieval history as a flag, a banner. And this happens really across all the political spectrum. In some ways, just either idealizing the Middle Ages or demonizing the Middle Ages, depending on what you want to do. And also in here there is a lot of confusion, because there are at least some people who were clever enough to understand, for example, that not everything was bad, but you can find them from both sides, which is kind of good, naturally. Now, I don't want to start this thing, because obviously even me now pointing it out doesn't quite make sense given what we're discussing, but you know what I'm talking about. I mean, there is a great confusion, disorientation, that I believe, and that's why I'm saying this, that could really be corrected and implemented, or at least, and let's say, and bettered by studying medieval communes, by studying what they were. Right? Also because there is this tendency also, I believe, that it's pretty widespread, to consider the city-state as a sort of, in fact, of a city-state. Like what we think today cities and states are. Right? It's as if the city was a kind of a monolithic political body, or that even its own institutions were some kind of homogeneous, especially when you attach the word state attached to it. And it's mostly conceived towards the later Middle Ages, while actually urban life, I mean political autonomy, etc., was something that was pretty well present throughout literally the whole Middle Ages, right? And especially naturally in certain areas. I mean, it's obvious that many regions of what had been the far north of the Roman Empire, like if you take Britain or other regions, northern France and Germany, I mean, there was of course a decline of that form of urbanization, but even there never quite died out properly. I mean, there are certain things that when they're started, they can't be put out, like but in other areas of Europe, like if you take southern France, central and northern Italy, but even certain areas of that are slightly worse documented, even in regions of Germany, like in western, southern Germany, aside from the bigger chunk of Germany where this didn't quite happen. So was pretty, was somehow it's evident, and also in here it's kind of silly to generalize, because also in here comparing these areas it depends on when we're talking about it. When cities existed everywhere, of course, and their political activity was crucial throughout all the Middle Ages. I mean, you can't understand, I don't know, why even how the Frankish kingdom was founded if you don't understand what Gallo-Roman cities were about, for example. Same goes for these worlds that remain a bit afloat, for example, between Christianity and Islam, right? Take Spain. This is a very big chapter even for the Byzantine Empire, that naturally is the continuator of late antiquity, that was centered on cities and is an empire based on a city that is a capital, that is a center of a true state. But also in there are similar phenomena, like there's a contraction of urbanism in there, and cities transform in very different ways. There are cities forming even alongside the Russian rivers in the Far East. I mean, it's all very wide and complicated. And already for this reason, you understand that we can't have a specialist dealing with all of them at once, right? Because already if you don't know a language, you can't talk about, at this point there is a great quest for things like political correctness, for example, saying you should always say the perspective of the other. But if you don't know the language, how the hell can you do that? I mean, you have to make history, you don't have to make policy here. So it's a very complicated thing to do, and in general, there are also different backgrounds. There are different levels of documentation. There are different national historiographies. Like there are many countries in Europe that still have to fill the gap that exists with others, for example, relatively to history in general. I would say this is particularly evident. So this is also a dramatically interesting field of expansion and work for deconstruction of a common European school, for example, that has to deal with this at a point. And how can we do it if Europeans at large probably don't even know about this, don't know about communes and their importance, their etc. So you understand how many problems, but also how much field for investment into this field. So basically we are in front looking at our past, historiographical past, generations of scholars from history of law, of institutions, of economy and society, etc., committed to the research of theories that could be more, let's say, adequate to explain in a kind of a unitary fashion the phenomenon of communalism. So here's where the problem started, and what we can though learn from even mistakes that have been done and that we have surpassed, I would say, at this point. So that's why something else should follow. I think this is just an impression. I don't really know about this, but I think that for now the majority of the answer has come tendentially from for the very beginning of the Middle Ages, and it came because at this point in history, late antiquity is particularly fashionable. So and it also has some advantages, I would say, in terms of actual research, but it's all a field that has to be completely rewritten, especially on the base of archaeology, because of the continuity from the let's say the Roman city and the early medieval one. But also in here we have very different kind of medievalists, right? Just an anecdote. Once I was researching about a city from in the first half of the 14th century, and I wrote to a scholar to ask for some advice, who had studied. There was a specialist basically on the history of that same city, but in the second half of the 14th century, where this guy wrote me back saying, "Oh, as you probably know, I deal only with the second half of the 14th century, so I don't know." And I was just asking, like, what kind of books should I read about the history of that same city, like a few decades before the time he's studying. We have reached this level of hyper specialization, where basically no one sees past his nose, and how can we even presume, to be goodwill to start this broader understanding. So I would love to see early high and low medievalists talking together about these continuities, right? And it's very important because it's the same concept of Middle Ages that fundamentally tells you that the Middle Ages are something else, right? So intrinsically, if you study ancient cities, you don't study medieval cities. But why? That's why I'm saying that late antiquists or early medievalists were naturally the ones that discussed the most, because that's the area of greater connection. Surely there is sound dialogue between modernists and late medievalists, but I think that we need something in the middle, especially for I would say from the 8th to the 14th century. That is definitely a dramatically interesting moment in history to study and to reconnect to the others. So I'm talking about this because naturally there has been, since an early age, among scholars in general in our history, those who privileged the elements of continuity between the let's say the orders of ancient cities and the one of the Middle Ages, right? Others, for example, have stressed instead the relation, the continuity between the communal institutions and the organs that regulated during the High Middle Ages the exercise of the arts and crafts, which is naturally so. These are two interesting perspectives, for example, because it's evident that this, let's say, all of these tracks are very seducing and have been obviously explored all, right? The problem is when you pretend that track is the only one, or at least the most important one. And generally, if you want to express a thesis, to formulate a thesis, you're going to go towards that direction, to reinforce it and to give it more importance than maybe the one it is. Historians tend to do it today much less often, differently from other specialists, and maybe need investments to carry out it. But there is also in here, in academia, a great deal of money involved, which is a problem because naturally that is what everybody searches, and it's also a shame in this sense that I have my own ideas, but naturally in a quite ideal society, as they're mostly economical opinions I have, that fundamentally I think research shouldn't be I can't say shouldn't be funded, but let's say that the healthiest research, and this happened throughout history all the time, are the ones that are, let's say, spontaneously founded, right? Or privately founded, or, well, this is debatable actually, and I realize it's kind of wrong, especially even from a strictly strategical point of view. We do need statal investments in certain fields of research, but with history, here it's not about field of research for having, I don't know, better military or something that you really need now as a regular asset. Here we're talking about history. That is something that fundamentally you need to answer questions that are more, let's say, that are more fruitful, the more they derive from an autonomous investment that is a genuine curiosity, in my opinion, rather than an actual need. Because let's be honest about it, I'm also making a research at this point, and the only reason why I do it, it's because I'm curious about that. Like, it's obvious that I need some titles as well. That's good. I would have done it anyway with some other craft, but my point in here is trying to answer a question, right? I mean, I don't care even about the title, really. I would be pretty disappointed if I didn't get it, but here, what I'm doing all the time is not securing my title, is really trying to give a damn answer. Because that can really have an effect, a positive impact. Like, it can help society. And that's the same reason why I make videos on YouTube, because I believe that talking about this stuff is necessary for us to expand our mind, to become better citizens, better people, wherever you want to say it. Because that's really by posing yourself these questions that you kind of understand, you expand your awareness about the complexity of the world, and therefore you don't stop to simplistic interpretations and try to go beyond. That's really why we make history, right? Because at the end of the day, there are not so many other reasons for doing it. But aside from this is just a rant digression. But as we were saying here, these two hypotheses, the continuity between, for example, ancient city and medieval city. Now, this is very important, and it's very, very, very overlooked. This has been stressed naturally chiefly by the late antiquists and early medievalists, for obvious reasons. This has naturally to do, has a focus mostly on Southern Europe, because that's where this happened the most, and where there is more evidence, by the way, which is a cause and consequence at the same time of the same phenomenon. But also in here, you can't explain it like the communalism simply through this. Like, ancient cities were not like medieval ones. Like, one of the most radical and dramatic differences between ancient civilization and medieval civilization is that ancient civilization crumbled, medieval civilization lived on and prospered and transitioned to something bigger and better, and because of cities, right? Never forget about this. I always get terribly annoyed when people suggest that fundamentally medieval cities were worse than the ancient ones, or that were less powerful, they had less beauty. That's not the point. That's actually false and wrong by all standards. But secondly, and don't tell me, oh well, Rome had 1 million inhabitants. That's not the point. That's not really the number of inhabitants. What makes the point of the story is also wealth, quality of life, right? And also in here, it depends on what cities we're talking about, because obviously an early or even a high medieval city was normally not like a Roman one, but also in here it depends, because already from the 14th century, basically Europeans managed to replicate the same standards of living with Antony in Rome, at least in cities like Florence, for example. But aside from this, So you realize how complicated it is, but you know, communalism, just pointing out, wasn't there. Um, for example, also relatively to the other hypothesis, um, there were corporations in ancient Rome, but they weren't at all so shaped like, to the point of being communes, right? Transforming the cities into communes that were kind of autonomous, etc. There was definitely a certain degree of autonomy also in the ancient world, but nothing like medieval communalism. That was a very different thing. It definitely did give rise to city-states at one point, but also it had a completely different political dialectic with public authority. Those who want to stress, for example, the cause of communes instead between the institution, the communal, and or let's say the development of arts and crafts, cannot explain this just through that, because first of all, why is that medieval cities developed arts and crafts in a way ancient cities didn't? Why is that they do build effectively, as but this is a very economistic perspective. It's naturally wrong, because communes are largely founded also by the feudal element, which is often overlooked. There is this dramatic stereotype that citizens were just in the city, they were just citizens like artisans and craftsmen. I mean, medieval cities had knights like in any other, for example, feudal context, but this also is seemingly overlooked. And often they were the same people, by the way. So just for saying that you don't have the city isolated from the rest of feudal hierarchy at all. Other scholars have excuse me, just to finish with this last hypothesis also came into my mind, as we were saying before, the relation with public authority. Right? Things could have gone very differently if, look at the Byzantine Empire. They didn't have communalism like in the West. Why is that? Some tried, but in there you had a Constantinople that basically choked almost every form of initiative. Right? The only thing that resembles a city-state in the Byzantine Empire is Thessalonica, that doesn't quite like to be under Constantinople, tries to sneak away. To push for decentralization. There was Monemvasia, for example. There was more kind of a small port. Small, not so small, but nothing to like the maritime republics in Western Europe. And that's why, for example, the Italians take over the markets in the Byzantine Empire. So that there were actually Greek, let's say Byzantine bankers, especially towards the late, like in the 15th century. They're somehow well documented, but they represented just a tiny part of the wall. And sometimes they were developing this stuff, and also because the empire was fragmenting, so there was really much more decentralization. Take powers like Trebizond, for example, had always tried to push towards that direction of becoming sort of autonomous city-states. But also in here we could rephrase it definitely better, because also in here, what does it really mean to be part of the Byzantine Empire? So the Byzantine Empire was literally like a modern state when everything was uniform at all. In many ways, the Byzantine Empire also resembles the rest, but by sheer quantity, you can't compare, for example, that world in terms of development of communalism with Western Europe. So why is that? These are important questions you have to answer. So it's not just about arts and crafts. You have also to explain why arts and crafts can sometimes even emancipate themselves in their communal institutions from the feudal order. But also highlighting the fact that they were constantly cooperating with it at other levels. So you see how complicated that is. I could think of other stuff, but maybe it's better we skip I think you got the idea. Other scholars identify the origin of city communes from the evolution of the market rights in urban law, which is pretty interesting as well, because indeed there is a strong economical component in the rise of cities during the Middle Ages, right? But also in here it's not just economical, right? This doesn't answer some other political matters. Why is that economical development started to happen in the first place, and why does it seem to develop, for example, exactly the most in those cities that are kind of more autonomous from the rest of the from let's say public authority, for example. Yes, of course, the city is born traditionally as a marketplace. Like, I can't think of a city aside from certain ones that have an eminently military character, but even in their, they all evolved through some form of depot of grain, etc., for the surrounding countryside. Always bear in mind, also in here, what about the relation with the countryside? Because cities exist only because there is a countryside. You can't have that demic concentration if you don't have a sound agricultural surplus to sustain them from the surrounding areas. Yes, in the low Middle Ages there are cities where even will occur, especially with the plague and the famines and stuff like that, with grain imports, but that's kind of exceptional. And it doesn't last. They need the countryside to produce. Would it control the countryside? What was the relation between the commune and the countryside? Because this varies dramatically in the rest of Europe. In different areas of Europe. There are cities who are literally able to expand their control in the surrounding countryside, and even other cities. There are cities that have become prosperous market centers, but under the firm feudal direction of a bishop, of a king, of a duke, or whatever. So this is particularly important. Also, which kind of markets are we really talking about? Because are these market centers of under a unique political control? Or are these markets interdependent? Like, it makes a huge deal of difference if you take the market of Genoa, that is a single city that behaves fundamentally like a sort of a maritime, of commercial, autonomous political and military power, and the Hanseatic League, that are all many markets brought together and cooperating and also sometimes even clashing among each other. So markets look far away since the very first beginning, right? The myth that European cities were just a close-range economy is like it's fairy tale. This stuff, even during the early Middle Ages, were regional level, at least in the main centers, and then they grew even intercontinental at one point. I mean, you don't get Venetians getting to China for no reason, in this sense. So, and with which other markets do they cooperate, though? Because even when you have a unique political direction, you also need other markets to trade with. And in which relations are you into these? How do we explain, for example, the rise of southern European maritime cities? If we presume that if you don't consider, for example, Saracen trade, piracy, and slavery, because many people, for example, still believe that the second invasions were sort of atomic bomb, or where the Europeans had to remain covered in their shelters and stuff like that, while especially in certain contexts we see that this is dramatically untrue, that some of the most massive developments in European economy in those areas were expanding aggressively through trade with the Muslims, for example, that they eventually contributed afterwards when trade balance was shifted to kick them out of their own markets, which is, and seize them. So this is, for example, deeply overlooked. Which kind of Europe are you studying? Like, are you studying Northern Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe? There are so many differences in here. Same goes for, think about the difference between the Viking entrenched rings and in Constantinople, let's say. And yet there was a trade net that connected them. So also in here, can we spot just, let's say, the ancient urban rights, the local urban rights? And also in here, how does that happen? I mean, where is that market laws recognized? Like, there are public authorities recognizing that you can't have market law without a formal recognition. Well, sometimes it happens actually, but in certain cases, I mean, you can't have it without being granted. Or and this does make a difference, because city rights and market rights were, for example, one of the most effective ways to make, especially in certain areas of Central Europe, to make cities grow, sometimes out of nothing, or at least very small centers, very small towns, that were to become instead major cities in Central Europe, historically speaking, and having a privileged relation with the crown, right? So here, it makes big difference, for example, between being, maybe some certain cities were also the residence of kings. So it's so damn difficult. Think about the pre-existing settlements, like a city like Lübeck, that is the first, most important city of the Hanseatic League. Well, that stood over a pre-existent Slavic settlement had gone destroyed. Between wars, that is refounded by Henry the Lion, is granted city rights, market rights, and it's expanding to the Baltic Sea. This is important, and that depends naturally on what the Kingdom of Germany was at the time, what the Duke of Saxony was doing, what was the royal and imperial policy of the time, and institutional processes. Who did grant rights? There were cities that simply grew by themselves instead, and in that case they weren't, at a certain point they might have been recognized, but they would have had markets, pretty important markets by themselves. Certain cities started minting their own coins, for example. Sometimes that happened without a formal recognition. That made a huge difference, because if you are an autonomous city you can mint coins, well, this is not really something you can decide from a day to another, because you have to have a reliable name, a reliable reputation for doing it, which means you have to be a sound political power, who also has precious metals, and makes his mark, let's say, accepted around as a certificate of reliability in this sense. Not all cities have it, and there are other cities who copy that mark. So others look, for example, instead at the birth of the at the rise of rural communes that would have born essentially from the decentralization of the ancient Frankish tribunals. What does this mean? It means that once upon a time, the Carolingians had tried to have something like a state, something like, which means obviously they never got it, but they started to try it. I mean, to have naturally certain points, because if anything, if you want to rule over an empire is as big as that one, you have to point some centers of power in some way. You need some degree of uniformity of common script. Hence, the Caroline language comes from, and you need some centers. You need even some administrative centers. So when Carolingian Empire obviously collapses, this brings to the idea that there were certain public centers of authority that naturally correspond to certain cities sometimes, because counties were usually based on the ancient Roman districts with the city and the diocese, so also in here never underestimate bishops for the rise of communes. They're so very important, because they had all a entourage of notaries, of lawyers, of administrators who knew what administrating meant. And the lay authorities in here needed the ecclesiastical ones to take care of this stuff. The famous missi dominici that are sent by, this is basically meant that there had to be a layman. But obviously in the Carolingian Empire didn't know how to write nor how to read. That had to just to fight, because obviously that's what the Carolingian count is really about. But then you needed a clergyman, and they had to write and to administrate, etc., because the count theory was in charge of justice. So this was a very important meeting ground of intersection. So theory is when the Carolingian Empire breaks, this rights, this forms of let's say of centralized direction, centralized they break, and they get spread across the territory. So basically this means that once, for example, the local count becomes too weak to exercise power, to exercise justice, to protect the community, simply certain new communities rise, and they forms this universitas or commune, right? So this is, I suspect, particularly a branch of what has been, of course, the Carolingian Empire, so the post-Carolingian kingdoms. So the idea is that there is a sort of translation of legal activity and authority from the ancient tribunal of the count to these local communities. So hence from there, the community entitles itself to self-administrate. That's the concept. So these are very localistic perspectives that are very interesting, and that are also effective in some ways, but they don't tell us all. There are other scholars who instead built their own theories beyond the prevalently juridical horizons, and stress instead the some sort of globalizing interpretations of socio-economical nature, and let's say socio-economical and political nature, looking at the rise of the commune as an initiative of the let's say mercantile bourgeois class that kind of say strived to surpass its own extraneity to feudal society. Now, this is a very controversial theory in some ways, but it doesn't lack some elements of of truth, at least for what evidence can furnish. It is controversial because it's naturally a very classist interpretation in some way, um, but at a structural level, it it does make in part some sense, meaning that there were certain classes that were rising prevalently within the cities, because that's their natural, say, harbor of development, that try to, let's say, that developed a certain consciousness or identity, and that try to autonomize themselves, not really from the feudal hierarchy as a whole, but from trying to getting more autonomy, more space. What is very interesting about this, if you study it seriously, is that they weren't really trying to escape at all from feudal hierarchy. They were simply trying to seize public rights, right? It's like for example, the Italian communes. The Italian communes do something very interesting. That is, they, after the Ottonian time, bishops had become very powerful. Then eventually, as you know, the Ottonian power crumbles. There are not, strong emperors in Italy anymore for like a century and a half, or at least, there was some, but they never quite really achieved what the Swabians after and the Ottonians before could. So what happens is the bishops remain without support, and the let's say this urban, let's say, lay classes that comprehend both the military class, so the knights that were getting urbanized and gentrified at this point, and albeit maintaining one foot still in the countryside, and this middle class men fundamentally that do not basically get rid of what the city had gotten in this sense in terms of rights, of communal rights during Ottonian times, because the Ottonians had appointed bishops in Italy as of communal dignity, so which meant that there weren't no feudatories, lay feudatories that were actually competitors of the Ottonians for the control of the Italic kingdom. They entrust everything to the bishops. So what the communal class does, and forming the commune later on, kind of in the same period, is that they assume those same communal powers, sometimes even in the name of the bishop, that maybe they had even overthrown as an individual, that by putting someone else who was kind of more conciliant to them, or maybe together with the bishop, so that they began to say, you know what, we are counts, so we have the rule over all this district that is far naturally beyond the city walls, and we try to extend the power in there. And also in here, how many factors are present? I mean, obviously Italian cities were the most developed at this point. They were richest ones. They are the ones that at this point really go beyond feudal hierarchies. Like when Frederick Barbarossa arrives in Italy, he's terrified. You find communes that had expanded their control, their authority over feudal lords. It's something in Germany was completely unheard. It was like the world gone upside down. So you realize how many differences in this context. And these interpretations, if you study, for example, the clashes between the Swabians and the Lombard League and all that stuff, you see that naturally certain historiographers tried to depict this as kind of a national clash, but it wasn't anything like that. I mean, literally anything like that. It was all about having more or less rights within the same Holy Roman Empire and feudal hierarchy. None of these cities would have ever conceived to be something out of imperial authority. They needed the emperor, and of the hell they needed it. If anything, to sanction even their own privileges, their own. There are different cases. Take Venice, for example. Venice, that has a lot to do with those clashes, for example, because it's kind of managing the stuff is between the Byzantines that are trying to sneak into Italy, and to make the Swabian Empire crumble and all this stuff. Those, for example, are theoretically Byzantine Empire. Like Venice, it's outside of the Holy Roman Empire, notoriously, but it's still developing in somewhat similar fashion, like albeit with some important differences from the other Italian communes. You get how much this is complicated. Throughout all the Holy Roman Empire, there are ecclesiastical principalities. Think about the great German electors of Cologne, that at this point is the largest city in Germany, has something like between 30 and 40,000 inhabitants. It's one of the largest cities of the north, but also Mainz and Trier. And there are the great other archbishops. Take the primate of Germany, the Archbishop of Salzburg, and the power that Salzburg had, as the name says, the Burg of Salt, because that's where the word mine salt they exported up along the Danube to Constantinople. Of the Bishop of Trento, for example, that was juridically in Germany, in the in the Kingdom of Germany, but geographically from the south of the Alps, of the Patriarch of Aquileia, for example. Thinking and how in this case, for example, it's the bishop that still manages the situation, right? It has not been overthrown, especially in Germany. In Germany, like bishops, as you know, have a dramatic importance. They have armies of tens of thousands, military retinues, even abbots in that case. But bishops are grounded chiefly in two cities, as you know, as in all Western Europe, basically, and they have this incredible importance. There are communes also in Germany, northeastern Germany, for example, that fight against bishops at one point. But at the end of the day, the bishops win. Because they are great territorial lords. They're princes of the empire. They're warrior bishops, like many other European warriors. Like you can find them all over Europe. But just for saying how the relations really can change within the cities. The economical side of the story. I mean, structurally speaking, how much effectively communalism has to do with urbanism at this point. And this is really important. It's a very important key of interpretation because, yeah, it's kind of totalizing. It kind of sounds Soviet by certain standards, but it's really evident because Europe here, for medieval standards, is rocketing to the stars at one point. It's and it does pass mostly through the cities. Like they're not really the cities. It's a much broader thing. It has to do with the countryside chiefly, but cities pivot this and become this enormously powerful centers. Like European cities are thriving exactly in this moment in which Byzantine and Islamic cities have start kind of to slow down. And they keep growing. So at that point, you can't say, well, it was the local market rights or the thing. Well, it's a broad phenomenon. But also in here, what is that? Is it Marx or Weber? Yeah. It's the idea of is it the structure, the socio-economical thing, or the political thing? Right. It's both, obviously, at the same time. Which one prevails over the other? It's difficult to say, right? It's difficult to say. It was all about the structure. You should start always from the structure. And there are people who really change the course of history just by political and military action, just for making a bit of a later example. What was more important to you, according to you, the Fugger bankers or Martin Luther? Like for the history of the 16th century. These are not. I mean, Luther maybe, yeah. In this kind of, it goes beyond, but overall, it's difficult to quantify it in general. There is some sort of, in any case, the extraneity to feudal society doesn't make sense. Let's be honest about this. It's obvious that the feudal elites had a great contempt towards the commoners, communalities in general, but it doesn't exist. I mean, the concept that cities want to get themselves free from the empire. I think the only city that ever theorized anything like that was Florence, but it kind of always remained on paper in the mind of some intellectuals. Florence never, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire, point, end of the story. And it would remain up to the 19th century. So it's not a world in which you can do without the emperors, because you think that the emperor is in a feudal oppressor and all this stuff. It doesn't happen like that. Also because cities are basically struggling to get the same power that feudal elite has, and they managed to do it, especially in certain these contexts. And interestingly enough, when we look at humanism or the Renaissance, what you see is that in the process the feudal elite has kind of gentrified, become more refined in tastes, in fashion, in all things that came from the cities, from these commoners in practice. They're oligarchs, let's say, better. They're aristocrats who were richer sometimes even than kings. And at the same time, the urban aristocracies feudalize in taste. They make tournaments, they fight as knights, they read about courtly literature, they acquire actually feudal titles, because these cities at one point become, take Milan, that becomes a duchy. There was nothing like in Lombardy, like a pre-existent feudal institution that, it was based on what Milan had done by itself fundamentally. That gets recognized, obviously in exchange of money, and also in here how much had it played the fact that the Holy Roman Empire by the 13th century fragments, politically speaking. These are all great differences, because they passed even through things like battles of Legnano that were about, in fact, the struggle between the emperor and certain cities at that point. So you see how deeply intertwined this is, and how you can't say, well, it's this or that. It's all together. But the problem is finding the exact proportion into this. And historically speaking, you can be sure that we'll never actually get to the correct proportion, but it's expanding into the details of this realities that we can expand our knowledge about that world, and understanding its complexity, and not stopping to the stereotypic view of the Middle Ages. So there are other scholars instead that has conceived or viewed the Commune as a product of the eternal clash between the aristocratic and democratic forces, right? This is very interesting, because instead it looks at the balance within the same communal world, and saying what was that commanded really within that, and why do certain communities form even within the cities that are naturally composite according to the corporatist structuration we've seen before, and that are managed to take over. Because indeed in the communes there was a pretty harsh clash between those who wanted to control the city. That was a real thing. There were enormous wars about controlling cities, because controlling the city meant most of the times to control this enormous, these florid markets, fortified space that could control the countries. It's very important. And this is naturally interesting because there are several clashes. There could be, an external threat, for example, like the bishop. Like the bishop could be internal, but sometimes, for example, like in Germany, have you seen before, bishops controls several cities, not just the one of its own diocese or archdiocese, for example. It can be an internal threat that is, however, kind of not even internal, not even a threat. Not just an internal, not just a threat. For example, like in the Italian cities, you find that the feudal elite is the one that founds the commune proper, like an institution. And there is, like, for several generations, just the knights ruling the cities. And then you find instead the middle classes that partly overthrow the military class, but they still remain in contact with them because they're populars and they're not professionals of war like the knights, who also have castles in the countryside and torment the city, and therefore the city first fights but then needs help and then calls other knights and maybe were the same guys as before in part, and there are all these intersections between the various groups and factions within this, in the local level, the regional level, international level. So it gets so complicated that you can't even just distinguish the aristocrats and the democrats, let's say, because sometimes they kind of appear to be the same people. Like there are merchants that are so wealthy as noblemen, in fact they become knights themselves. So it's very complicated. There are many problems also about immigration. Like there are certain cities where this is more evident, where there are lots of peasants coming from the countryside, because this is actually how most European cities grew at this time. If you look at the rate of growth of European cities, it's not because these guys were copulating like rabbits. It's because there were lots of people coming from the countryside, and some of them naturally they have a different culture. They have different values. Remember that in many cities in Europe, there were families that theoretically were extremely ancient. Like take a city like Rome that could date this in very, very ancient nobiliar families in the Middle Ages. Well, in certain communes it happens that all these immigrants from the countryside become so powerful that they overthrow the pre-existing ruling class, and then they reblend and they re-stratify. So it's really a problem. There is the entire story is changed because of this, and then maybe there is things like the plague, for example. Naturally, the cities are the major demic concentration at the time, so that's where the plague strikes the hardest. But this paradoxically reinforces the oligarchic character control of the cities, because usually the plague hits especially the most denourished, the lower strata of the population. Therefore, more people die. And the individuals who survive remain richer, or at least are able to, within the same city, to occupy more areas, and therefore to eventually, when economy revives, to grow more powerful. So all problems that eventually, as you know, also change the directions in European history, in terms of what if the Black Death hadn't happened, right? Lots of things would happen. Sometimes some people say, well, it had to happen because basically it was not a cause but a consequence of the pre-existing decline of the cities, the contraction. Other people say it's climate change, and maybe it's a bit of everything actually, but we cannot know. Also, given the nature of resources, right? Some people simply say, and especially in, I don't know, I've been reading many manuals of medieval history from here and there. It often, the development of cities is usually attached to the revival of the year 1000, right? The idea that, things start to get better, cities grow, and consequently there is this form of associationism that brings to the commune. Broadly speaking, it does make sense, doesn't it? So, and it can be reconnected to all the other things. But the problem is that today, most obviously, we cannot accept in in general those theories that pretend to generalize and to explain everything in only one, in fact, only one in one theory, right? So there is this infinite shade of manifestations in the communal civilization, in front of which the historian has to say, well, you know, we have to we can't generalize, obviously. And therefore, this brought as a consequence, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, to some form of hyper-specialization, for which people say, okay, well, let's study only, I don't know what, let's study just medieval Bohemia about it. And so they will concentrate on Bohemia, but what about all the rest? This was just an example, but I mean, and never underestimate, for example, the national values that communal civilization has. How much they're taken into consideration or not taken into consideration. It's most obvious, and for obvious reasons in general, that for the Italian historiography, the communal phenomenon is probably the Italians are the ones who explore this the most. Then for the French is completely different. Also depending on which France are we talking about. Because for the King of France, for example, backing one city or another, in the north especially, was a matter of acquiring prestige, sometimes even among the larger feudatories of the kingdom that had been supportive, like bishops, but maybe they'd become too powerful, and all many intrigues. Southern France, Occitania, let's say better, had a situation that was much more resemblant, for example, to the Italian cities. Also in Spain, the relation with the cities was very complex. I think I talked one of my very first videos, more than 1 year ago, I don't remember. I think it was the case of Sahagún, the city of Sahagún. And it was interesting because it basically was the monarchy playing with the city, with the town actually, but eventually expanding against the aristocracy and so on. What about with Germany? With Germany, there is a great historiographical importance in the cities, especially considering certain views of feudalism versus also communalism. Also in Germany, it's much more shaded actually, because Germany has a much stronger federal perspective about certain things. But the Hanseatic League is, has its own value with those specific characteristics that correspond to also a political direction, if you think about it. At least historically speaking, it was like that. In Britain, I don't know how much the development of cities is studied, also because in there, it's not that outside from London, it's not that there were many big, and also in there was there were like York, Norwich, and Bristol, for example, but the general, I don't know much about English communalism, telling the truth. It did exist, evidently, and I also read something about it, but it was obviously much more reduced. Think, for example, about all those Muslim Spanish cities that fell into the hands after the Reconquista, like Sevilla, Cordoba, Granada, for example, or all the centers of the Netherlands, for example, and what it means for Dutch historiography, for example, to study about those cities. For example, in a land that, well, here we're getting things too complicated, but like Leiden, Amsterdam, Delft, Haarlem, and all. But what it means for an area that was brutally under urbanized to grow like it was at in the end of the Middle Ages, with some of the largest cities in Europe, and that were destined to become also some of the most important financial centers of modern Europe. So different European historiographers look at the communal phenomenon with different eyes, with different experiences, with different perceptions, and even bias, of course, and this wakes. That's why we should talk a lot about it, because we could be surprised about how much in common yet of difference there is. And in this perspective, what it really was, because obviously European states developed through certain historical processes that at the time were sometimes not even thought that could happen. Like, they don't correspond to today's national perceptions, like even identitarily speaking. So I don't know how to end this video. Let's say that studies up to now have, I mean, the most recent ones at least, have tried to trace this kind of typizations, let's say, and it's fair, because the Middle Ages should be, I mean, they obviously lend themselves to be read in that way, right? Both because of this different historiographical traditions and the objective differences that did exist. So it's not so surprising after all, and we all accept it as even a very intellectually interesting and provoking challenge. And there is a lot. For instance, I study, as you know, I studied military history, and I do study city militias a lot, and I also, this is something we didn't talk about it today. This is the strange thing about Schwerpunkt, that I basically never talk about things that I'm actually more expert on, and always talking about things I don't know, at least well. But even in there should be a lot to say, because even through the military organization you can find completely different realities, but sometimes even very close geographically to each one, so that you can't generalize. So communalism, maybe today I don't know how much we touched on communalism proper, and it doesn't end here. Like, I have in store tens and tens of videos more in communal Europe, and I know that probably you find it's boring, but it's really not, and we will try. I don't know why, actually. As you know, I choose my topics very randomly. So actually, I'm plenty of stuff to talk about the single cities and their examples, like picking this or that city, and we will do it, like Amiens, I don't know, Nuremberg, or Pavia, so many cities that had all their own history. This is probably the most important thing to start from, which is kind of hyper-specializing, but being aware of the fact that differences in the Middle Ages are interesting, because after all, everything was much more similar structurally than we imagine, right? There is also this great difficulty in understanding the Middle Ages, I believe, because it appears, if I don't know how you feel, for example, after this video, if you are right till the end at this point, from the beginning, whether you feel more confused than else, because I have my own ideas about it, and of course I don't pretend I can explain fully, by the way, such complicated things about which I also don't know so much. But there is an attitude that I think prevents many people from getting interested in medieval history in general. That is that medieval history is objectively so complicated. I mean, if you study Roman history, well, there is Rome, point, end of the story. It's a dramatically complicated topic on its own, but it's always the same institution, right? Here, every place has its own institution, and even though there are higher institutions, nominally, at least in most of the cases. So an idea is saying, well, how can I understand this if I don't get first into the minutiae, let's say, of this topic? Well, you can always bear in mind, as I was saying now, that we're talking about the Middle Ages, so it's not a world where there were dramatic differences. I mean, if you were to study world in 2019, you would have dramatic difficulties in understanding how it is, because that is so complicated, and yet we presume to know something about it. The Middle Ages was really, in this sense, at least in this perspective, relatively flatter. So it's not that cities, in spite of all their differences, differed so radically. And communes also, there was different. There is all a study, for example, of the lexicon. Like, there are even different terms. Like, in Northern Europe, normally there is the term guild. In Southern Europe, there is corporation, or or arts, something like that. That is also important, but sometimes these differences shouldn't be used as to show how things were different, but actually how they were terming basically the same things that also here go beyond the Middle Ages and should be studied in this perspective. In a world where politics and society worked fundamentally in the same way, there were some limits from how the world was, production and potential. So the Middle Ages are interesting because you can relatively easily highlight the differences given this common ground, right? It's very easy to do, relatively, right? So we shouldn't be scared, and we should try to reacquire some generalistic awareness about how the rest was, right? Because we arrived at a point in history in which we really need this. At least if we talk about as Europeans, or obviously everybody can be interested into it. I hope that many people follow me from all the rest of the world like this and are interested and have a lot to, let's say, to think about it also for their own countries. But when it comes, for example, to, as I was saying before, common European education, which will definitely happen sooner or later, at least I hope, because that there is also a civic need for this. Like, we need to work together, and how can we do it if we still pretend that we are all something different at the point it's my flag or your flag? It doesn't work. It makes us just divided and nothing else. And it's risky, especially in a world like ours, right? You know what happened yesterday. So, not in Europe, but close to us, definitely. These are not moments in which we can afford to look away, because we will be brought into it in a way or another. Not saying here that there is a political direction. You can think whatever you want, but if you want to think about it, you need to know certain things. You would say, well, does really studying medieval communes answers to 2019 problems? No, it doesn't, but it does help to think more complexly. That's how it helps. So yes, it does at the end of the day. Yes, as well as all history, actually. So okay. I don't think I have to add anything else at this point, because the video is already enough long as it is. So as usual, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.